Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA, Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. Imagine waking up to an eviction notice on your doorstep in a house you literally own outright. Now, imagine the person trying to kick you out is the HOA president who has no idea that I own half the neighborhood. Yeah, buckle up, this one gets wild. I had never been a fan of HOAs. Their endless rules, their pointless fines, and the way they acted like tiny dictators with clipboards just didn't sit right with me. But I never expected one to come after me so aggressively, let alone try to throw me out of my own house. It all started on a chilly Monday morning. I walked outside to grab my mail, still groggy from my first cup of coffee, only to find a bright red envelope stuck to my door. That was already a bad sign. Anything official looking from the HOA meant trouble. I peeled it off, flipped it open, and felt my stomach drop. Notice of violation, final warning. Failure to comply will result in immediate eviction. I actually had to reread it because it made no sense. Eviction in my own house. I didn't rent, I didn't have a mortgage, and I sure as hell hadn't signed anything that would give these people the power to do this. And yet, there was printed in bold ink, practically screaming at me. Apparently, I was in violation of multiple HOA rules, some of which I wasn't even aware existed. My infractions included things as ridiculous as failing to maintain an approved aesthetic, whatever that meant, unauthorized modifications to the exterior, which was hilarious because I hadn't changed anything since moving in, and creating a disturbance in the community, which was probably just my neighbor Karen being mad that I mowed my lawn at a different angle than she liked. I flipped the notice over, expecting some kind of joke, but no, there at the bottom was the signature of none other than Richard Albright, our self-important HOA president. The man had made a career out of micromanaging people's lives. He was the kind of guy who measured grass with a ruler, counted how many times you took your trash can in, and left nasty emails about improperly parked vehicles when they were perfectly fine. I had mostly ignored him over the years, paying the minimal dues and avoiding the neighborhood meetings, but now he was on my doorstep, metaphorically at least, trying to kick me out. I wasn't about to let that slide. I took the notice inside and started digging through my files. If they were going to play this game, I needed to know exactly what I was up against. First, I checked the HOA rules, which were about as dense and unreadable as a government tax code. Nothing in the document gave them the power to evict a homeowner. The worst they could do was issue fines or take legal action, both of which required way more effort than just slapping an eviction notice on someone's door. That meant one of two things. Either Richard was bluffing or he was trying to pull some serious shady business. Neither option was good for him. I decided to go straight to the source. That evening, there was an HOA board meeting, and you better believe I showed up. Usually, these meetings were filled with the same 5 people, Richard and his cronies bickering about fence heights and mailbox colors. This time, I made sure I had an audience. I called a few of my neighbors who had also been hit with fines recently and told them to come along. I wanted witnesses. When I walked into the community hall, Richard was already seated at the front, looking smug as ever. He barely glanced at me as he shuffled his papers, pretending to be busy. "Ah," he said after a moment, finally acknowledging me. "Mr. Carter, I assume you're here to discuss your violations?" I held up the eviction notice. "Yeah, Richard, I'd love to hear how you plan to kick me out of a house I own." The room went quiet. A few of the other board members exchanged glances, clearly confused. Richard, however, leaned back in his chair, that infuriating smirk still on his face. "It's all in the rules," he said smoothly. "You failed to comply with multiple regulations, and the board has the authority to enforce the standards of the community. Enforcing standards is one thing. Eviction is another." I stepped closer, holding up the HOA bylaws. Nowhere in this document does it say you have the power to remove a homeowner. So tell me, Richard, are you making up new rules, or are you just hoping I won't fight back? That wiped the smirk off his face. One of the other board members, a woman named Susan, cleared her throat awkwardly. "Well, technically, we can file legal action for noncompliance, and if enough fines accumulate, a lien could be placed." "Alien," I cut in. "You mean if I refuse to pay bogus fines, then maybe you can take me to court? And even then, A judge would have to agree. That's a long way from immediate eviction. Richard's face was turning red, but he wasn't backing down. The board has discretion over. No, Richard, I interrupted. You don't. And here's what's really funny. I pulled another document from my folder. I did some checking today, and it turns out I own quite a bit more property in this neighborhood than I realized. I let that statement sink in. Richard blinked. What are you talking about? My uncle was a real estate investor, I said casually. He left me a bunch of properties when he passed. I never really thought about it much until today. Turns out I own more than just my house. I own multiple homes, enough, in fact, that I hold a majority share of the voting power in this HOA. Silence. Richard's face drained of color. The other board members looked at each other, whispering. It was clear that no one had considered this possibility. So here's what's going to happen, I continued. You're going to take back this ridiculous eviction notice. You're going to wipe every single bogus fine you've issued me and anyone else you've been harassing. And if you don't, well, we can put it to a vote. Richard swallowed hard. You can't just. I absolutely can, I said, and I will. Unless, of course, you'd rather I start digging into HOA financials. I'm sure the rest of the neighborhood would love to know where all their dues have been going. He had no response to that. For the first time since I'd known him, Richard looked genuinely nervous. And that was just the beginning, because now that I knew the power I had, I wasn't just going to stop at saving my own house. I was going to take him down, and I was going to do it in the most satisfying way possible. This HOA war had only just begun. Richard might have backed down in the moment, but I knew he wasn't done. The man had built his entire identity around controlling this HOA, and people like him didn't just give up. Sure enough, it didn't take long for him to retaliate. The very next morning, I woke up to find a brand new violation notice taped to my door. This time it was a list, a long one. Grass height exceeds HOA standards by 0.3 inches. Trash can left 12 minutes past pickup window. Unapproved garden gnome in front yard. Driveway is too full of cars. Fence color not in compliance with neighborhood harmony. I actually laughed out loud reading it. This was total villain behavior. The man went home after our meeting and cooked up the pettiest revenge plan possible. But the real kicker? At the bottom of the list, in bright red letters, total fines due $4,750. For $1,750 for nonsense violations he made up overnight. I shook my head and walked to my laptop. Time to fight fire with fire. I started by researching HOA bylaws. The problem with Richard was that he counted on people not knowing the rules. He assumed homeowners would just see a fine, grumble, and pay it. But I wasn't just any homeowner. I had time, resources, and a serious grudge. Within minutes, I found something interesting. HOA boards cannot issue new fines without a proper review process. That meant Richard couldn't just scribble down whatever he wanted and slap a dollar amount on it. He needed the board to approve them first. And after that last meeting, I doubted the board was still fully in his pocket. But that wasn't all. The HOA rules also stated that all fines must be based on prior written warnings, and since I hadn't received any warnings before these fines showed up, that meant every single charge was completely invalid. I smiled and printed out the relevant pages. If Richard wanted a fight, I was about to give him one. My first counterattack, turning the tables. That afternoon, I marched straight to the HOA office. It was a dull, depressing little building near the community clubhouse where the board held their meetings. Inside, a frazzled-looking HOA secretary sat behind the desk. "Hi, I'm here about these fines," I said, setting the notice down in front of her. She barely glanced at it. "All violations must be paid within 30 days or further action will be taken." I cut her off with a friendly smile. "Actually, that's not true." She blinked at me. "Excuse me?" I tapped the HOA rulebook I had brought. "According to your bylaws, fines can only be issued after a formal review process, and that review process needs to include written warnings first. Since I never received any of these fines, they're completely unenforceable." Her face paled. I could tell she had no idea about this rule. She wasn't used to people reading the fine print. "If you check the records," I continued, "you'll see that Richard issued these fines without board approval, which means that if you try to enforce them, I can file a complaint with the state HOA regulatory board. She grabbed the notice, eyes darting over the numbers, and muttered, I'll have to check with Mr. Albright. You do that, I said cheerfully. And while you're at it, make sure he knows that if he tries this again, I'll be calling my lawyer. She didn't even argue. She just nodded and hurried to the back office. A few minutes later, she returned, and surprise, surprise, the fines had been dismissed. Round one me. HOA's next move, the fake inspector. I thought that might be the end of it, but no, Richard doubled down. A few days later, I got a surprise visit from a supposed neighborhood inspector sent by the HOA. The guy showed up in an official-looking vest, clipboard in hand, and immediately started circling my property, taking pictures. Can I help you? I called from my porch. Routine compliance inspection, he said without looking up. Now here's the thing. There was no such thing as an HOA compliance inspector. They didn't have the legal authority to conduct surprise inspections like this. This was just another scare tactic. So I pulled out my phone and started recording. Hey, what's your name? I asked, stepping closer. The guy hesitated. I don't have to give you that information. Oh, you absolutely do, especially if you're trespassing. He stiffened. I'm not trespassing. This is an HOA authorized inspection. I smiled. Great, in that case, let me just call the police and verify that. His face went from smug to panic in 3 seconds flat. He spun around and started walking off. Not so fast, I said. If you're official, you won't mind answering a few questions for the police, right? He practically ran to his car and sped off. I uploaded the footage to our neighborhood Facebook group with the caption, HOA sending fake inspectors to intimidate homeowners. Interesting. I wonder what else they're hiding. That post blew up. Suddenly, neighbors started sharing their own horror stories about Richard's tactics. Fines for violations they never committed, fake warnings, threats of legal action. The whole community was starting to turn against him. The twist, exposing the HOA's corruption. Then I got a message from someone unexpected, a former HOA treasurer. She wrote, You're not wrong about Richard. He's been cooking the books for years. I have proof. Oh, now, this was getting really interesting. We met up that evening, and she showed me years of financial statements. There were clear discrepancies. Money collected from homeowners that never made it into the HOA's official budget. Thousands of dollars were missing. Guess whose name was all over those records? That's right, Richard. The best part? I now had the power to bring it all down. Time for checkmate. Richard thought he could bully me out of my own home. He thought he could find me into submission. But what he didn't realize was that by coming after me, he'd exposed himself. Now I had proof that his fines were illegal, evidence that he was using fake inspectors to intimidate people, and financial records that could bury him in legal trouble. I wasn't just going to use this to get revenge. I was going to destroy the entire corrupt HOA system from the inside out. This war was far from over. Richard had officially lost control of the narrative. My post about the fake inspector had gone viral in our neighborhood Facebook group, and people were furious. Some homeowners started digging up their own HOA violation notices, realizing they had also been fined for completely made-up infractions. They shared stories about Richard's scare tactics, his favoritism with certain homeowners, and his suspicious HOA spending habits. I had thrown a match into a pile of dry leaves, and now Richard was scrambling to put out the flames. And that's when he made his biggest mistake yet, his desperate counterattack. The emergency meeting was set up a few days after the fake inspector incident. I received an official-looking email from the HOA board, subject, Emergency Board Meeting Attendance Required. Oh, this should be good. According to the email, the HOA was holding a special hearing regarding my pattern of noncompliance and my disruptive actions within the community. The wording was so dramatic you'd think I had been running an underground fight club in my backyard. Richard wanted to make an example out of me. He was trying to stage a public tribunal, probably hoping to intimidate me into backing down. Too bad for him. I had zero intention of playing along. So I invited the entire neighborhood to the meeting. The ambush turned against them. When I arrived at the HOA meeting hall, Richard was already there, sitting at the front like some kind of medieval king about to pass judgment. His cronies flanked him, nodding like trained parrots. The moment I walked in, I noticed something funny. There were multiple stacks of paper at Richard's table. He had printed copies of my Facebook post about the fake inspector. Oh, so this was personal. Richard stood and cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, this meeting has been called to address an escalating situation in our community. I almost rolled my eyes. The man sounded like he was delivering a presidential address. He continued, "One resident in particular has repeatedly violated HOA guidelines, spread false accusations, and encouraged a dangerous level of hostility toward the board." Ah, so that's how he was spinning this. As a result, Richard went on, "The board will be voting tonight on whether to pursue legal action against Mr. Carter for slander." The room erupted in murmurs. Even Richard's usual supporters looked nervous. Taking me to court over a Facebook post? That was insane. I took my time walking to the front. I could feel every eye in the room watching me. I picked up one of the printed Facebook posts from Richard's table and smirked. "You printed these out?" I asked, holding up the stack. "Wow, it must have really hurt your feelings." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Richard's face turned red. "This is not a joke," he snapped. "Oh, I know it's not," I said, which is why I came prepared too. I reached into my bag and pulled out my own stack of papers. Only mine weren't Facebook posts. They were HOA financial records. Richard's eyes widened as I laid them out for everyone to see. "Since we're talking about dangerous levels of hostility and false accusations, let's discuss some real violations. Like, for example, thousands of dollars in missing HOA funds." The room went silent. The financial scandal bombshell. I turned to the crowd. "See, I recently had a very interesting conversation with a former HOA treasurer who just happened to keep copies of old financial reports. And guess what? The numbers don't add up." I held up one document. "Here's a record from last year showing that homeowners paid over $200,000 in HOA dues. Now here's the expenditure report from the same year." I slapped another paper down. "Notice anything funny? That money never went toward community improvements, maintenance, or amenities. In fact, over $50,000 just vanished. No receipts, no justification." Someone in the back of the room whistled. Another homeowner muttered, "Holy SH*T. Richard stood up so fast his chair nearly toppled over. "That is an outrageous accusation," he stammered. "Is it?" I tilted my head. "Then why don't we do an independent audit? I'm sure the homeowners here would love to know where their money is actually going." Now Richard looked like he was about to pass out. The board turned against him. One of the other board members, Susan, cleared her throat awkwardly. "I think we should look into this," she said hesitantly. "If there's been a mistake." Richard turned on her like a rabid dog. "There's no mistake," he shouted. "This is just a distraction from his violations." "Violations?" I said, feigning confusion. "You mean the bogus fines you tried to hit me with? The fake inspector you sent to my house? Or do you mean the fact that I own more properties here than you do and technically have more voting power?" That was the kill shot. The entire room gasped. Even Richard's supporters started whispering among themselves. One homeowner stood up. "Wait, is that true? He owns more property?" I nodded. "It is. And since HOA votes are based on property ownership percentages, I actually have the power to call for a vote to remove the entire board." People started clapping. Richard looked like he was about to explode. The vote that changed everything. It didn't take long after that for the other board members to save their own skin quickly. They distanced themselves from Richard. The homeowners, now fully awake to the corruption, demanded an emergency vote right there on the spot. The result: Richard was officially removed as HOA president. An independent financial audit was scheduled immediately. The board agreed to suspend all pending violations and fines until the audit was complete. As the meeting adjourned, Richard stormed out, face red, fists clenched, muttering something about lawyers. I smiled as I watched him go. The HOA had tried to ruin my life. Instead, I had ruined them. But I wasn't done yet because after a little more digging, I was about to find one last bombshell, something that would make sure Richard never touched another HOA position again. This time, I was going to bury him. Richard had lost control, but he wasn't done fighting. After the disaster of the emergency HOA meeting, he had no choice but to step down as president. Rather than go quietly, he tried to stall, manipulate, and sabotage the transition. His last hope was that maybe, just maybe, he could bully his way back into power. Too bad for him. I wasn't about to let that happen. While he was licking his wounds, I was digging up the final nail for his coffin. When I walked into the next official HOA board meeting, I wasn't just there to finish Richard. I was there to burn his entire empire to the ground. The final HOA board meeting and Richard's last stand. The HOA's main office was unusually packed that night. Normally, these meetings were ghost towns attended only by the board members and maybe one or two homeowners who had nothing better to do. Not this time. Richard had pissed off too many people, and now the entire neighborhood was showing up to watch him squirm. I walked in with a thick folder of documents tucked under my arm. I had spent the last few days gathering evidence, cross-checking financial records, and consulting with a lawyer friend. What I had uncovered was enough to ensure Richard would never touch another HOA board again. When I took my seat near the front, Richard was already there, sitting stiffly between the remaining board members. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. His usual smugness was gone. Instead, his eyes darted around, watching the crowd like a cornered animal. Good. He knew what was coming. Richard tried to regain control and failed miserably. "Let's call this meeting to order," one of the board members said. Richard immediately cut in. "Before we begin, I'd like to propose that we move past this nonsense about financial audits and instead focus on restoring order to this HOA." The entire room groaned. A homeowner in the back shouted, "You mean move past the thousands of dollars you stole?" Richard's jaw clenched. "There's no proof of any wrongdoing." I smiled. "Actually," I said, standing up, "there is." I walked to the front of the room, folder in hand. "Over the past week, I've been looking into HOA financials. And while I already exposed some irregularities at the last meeting, I found something even better." I pulled out a copy of a bank statement. "This," I said, holding it up, "is a record showing that funds were transferred directly into a personal account belonging to Richard Albright." The room erupted. Richard's face turned the color of spoiled milk. "That's a lie," he sputtered. I slapped another document onto the table. "And this," I continued, "is an expense report showing lavish personal purchases made with homeowner dues, restaurant bills, high-end electronics, even a weekend at a luxury resort, all paid for with homeowner dues." More gasps, more murmurs. The entire room was closing in on Richard. A board member, one of his former allies, pushed back his chair and stood up. "I had no idea about this," he said, visibly shaken. "Richard, is this true?" Richard didn't answer. He just glared at me, his fist clenched like he wanted to punch me through a wall. So I twisted the knife. "One more thing," I said, pulling out the final piece of evidence. "This is a cease and desist letter from my lawyer. It outlines not only the fraud Richard has committed, but also the harassment, illegal fines, and intimidation tactics he used to target homeowners." I set it down. "And if the board doesn't act on this immediately," I said, locking eyes with Richard, "I'll be filing a formal lawsuit." At that point, it was over. Richard was removed and the HOA collapsed. One of the board members, clearly panicked, stood up and called for an immediate vote. All in favor of removing Richard Albright from the HOA permanently. A sea of hands shot up. Even his own board members voted against him. Richard shot to his feet, the chair screeching against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he stammered. "You can't just—" "Yes, we can," I said, cutting him off. "And we just did." That was it. The HOA president, the man who had terrorized this neighborhood for years, was officially stripped of all power. But I wasn't done yet. I turned to the crowd. "Now that Richard is gone," I said, "we need to ask ourselves, do we really want an HOA at all?" That's when the real vote happened, and it wasn't even close. By the end of the night, the HOA itself was dissolved. No more absurd fines. No more petty tyrants telling people what color they could paint their doors. No more HOA dictatorship. It was over. The aftermath and sweet, sweet karma. Richard left the meeting in humiliating silence. But karma had one last surprise for him, because once the financial audit was completed, the missing money was reported to the authorities. A few weeks later, Richard was arrested for fraud. I couldn't have scripted a better ending if I tried. With Richard gone and the HOA officially dead, the neighborhood thrived. Homeowners who had been bullied for years were finally free. I even went a step further and used my voting power to return any unfairly taken fees back to the community. Oh, and that HOA office Richard had used as his little kingdom, I turned it into a community garden, complete with a giant statue of my unapproved garden gnome. Because at the end of the day, revenge is a dish best served with flowers and a smug lawn ornament. Richard was gone, the HOA was gone, and I had one. But just when I thought it was over, I received a mysterious letter from another HOA across town. We heard what you did. We need your help. Looks like my work isn't done yet. The war was over, the HOA was gone, Richard was out of power, out of money, and out of options. And me? I had gone from being a random homeowner fighting off a ridiculous eviction notice to becoming the guy who dismantled an entire corrupt HOA from the inside out. It had been a long, exhausting battle, but in the end, it was worth it. I sat on my porch one evening, looking out the neighborhood. The tension that had once hung over this place like a storm cloud was gone. People were actually happy. Kids rode their bikes freely. Homeowners decorated their yards however they pleased. And best of all, there were no more HOA fines. No one was measuring grass with rulers. No one was threatening legal action over a trash can being out 15 minutes too long. And no one was acting like a wannabe dictator in a polo shirt. This was what a community was supposed to feel like. But just as I was ready to sit back and enjoy my victory, something unexpected happened. The mysterious letter arrived in a plain, unmarked envelope, slipped into my mailbox like a secret message. At first, I thought it was some leftover HOA nonsense, maybe Richard's last desperate attempt to take a final shot at me. But when I tore it open and started reading, I realized it was something completely different. Dear Mr. Carter, we heard what you did to your HOA. We need your help. Our neighborhood is dealing with something even worse, and we don't know where else to turn. The HOA here is out of control, and we're running out of options. If you're willing, we'd love to talk. Please consider it a fellow homeowner. I stared at the letter for a long moment, a smirk slowly creeping across my face. I had barely finished one HOA war, and now another neighborhood was calling me in like some kind of mercenary for hire. Part of me wanted to laugh. Part of me wanted to ignore it and move on with my life. But another part was very, very interested. What happened to Richard? Because I know you're curious. I know what you're thinking. What happened to Richard? Did he serve time? Did he worm his way out of trouble? Did he try to run another HOA somewhere else? But trust me, karma had plans for him. After the financial audit results came out and the authorities got involved, Richard faced multiple charges for embezzlement, fraud, and mismanagement of funds. His high-priced lawyer tried to argue that it was all a clerical error and that Richard had just been bad at bookkeeping. Yeah, nobody bought that. He didn't end up in prison, but he did have to pay a mountain of fines. He was banned from holding any HOA positions for life, which was probably the worst punishment imaginable for a guy like him. Oh, and his foreclosed house became the neighborhood recreation center. So every time he drove by in his beat-up 2005 Honda Civic because his fancy car got repossessed, he got to see kids playing, families gathering, and people enjoying a space that used to belong to him. Now that's what I call poetic justice. The neighborhood without an HOA, a better future. Some people worried that getting rid of the HOA would turn the neighborhood into chaos, that we'd suddenly be overrun with neon pink houses, abandoned cars on front lawns, and people raising goats in their yards. None of that happened. Turns out, when you treat homeowners like adults and let them make their own decisions, they actually take care of their properties better than the HOA ever did. People work together to handle maintenance issues instead of waiting for a useless board to do it. A community fund replaced the HOA fees, but it was completely voluntary. And guess what? More people contributed than ever before. No one abused their freedom. The neighborhood still looked amazing, but now it was because people wanted it to, not because they were being threatened with fines. And best of all, we had actual community spirit instead of fear. So now I got to ask you guys, would you take on another HOA fight? I mean, I thought this battle was one and done, but now I've got homeowners from another neighborhood reaching out for help. Do I step in and take down another corrupt HOA, or do I finally retire from the HOA war zone and just enjoy my victory? Let me know in the comments. Have you ever dealt with an insane HOA? Do you think they should exist at all? And what's the worst HOA horror story you've ever heard? Also, if you enjoyed this crazy HOA takedown story, don't forget to like this video because Richard's watching from his sad little rental apartment, and he deserves to see this go viral. Subscribe for more epic battles against HOA nonsense. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next, because who knows, this war might not be over yet. And remember, don't let petty tyrants control your life. Until next time, stay HOA free.